we would like to introduce one of our guests this evening. Is compañero Rolando Vergara. Wow. And Rolando is the first secretary of the permanent mission of Cuba to the United Nations. Please welcome compañero from Cuba, revolucionaria, Rolando Vergara.
Okay, first an honor to be here, to see these beautiful people who made with the solidarity with Cuba, Venezuela, and also with Nicaragua. So it's so important at this moment, as you mentioned before. First, if we say in 2014, in the new era of the diplomatic relationships between Cuba and the United States, so many people say, even from the solidarity movement, that the blockade is over. And the people say, okay, now the US citizen can travel to Cuba, can do this, can say that, but what happened? During the last 2 years of the Obama administration, it's true, we advanced in the diplomatic relationships, we made a lot of agreements in the agriculture, in the people-to-people interchange. So many persons was allowed to travel to Cuba to meet the Cuban reality and to transmit here, bring here what the Cuban citizens and what the Cuban people really is and really are. So, but what happened since the very beginning of the Trump administration? Okay, we are at this moment on a step back, and we continue back, and the people say, "Wow, the Cuban has to do this." Well, Cuba is always, we always be there. But what is the U.S. government wants to Cuba? Has our first secretary of the Communist Party, our Raúl Castro, said during the assembly, we proclaimed the new constitution, the new Cuban constitution. He said, they always blind to Cuba, though every evil around the world. What has happened with the propaganda? As you mentioned, they say that we have military positions in Venezuela, and we have 20,000 doctors. Person who save life, not to make military power to the President Maduro, how they say, regime. Cuba support the Bolivarian revolutionary revolution in Venezuela. We support, because they follow, as Nicaragua, all that we want for the rest of the citizens in Latin America, and not only for Latin America, just for, it's also for the rest of the world. Because we give us to the rest of the countries what we want, what we have, not what we have enough. For that reason, as you mentioned, since the very beginning of the Cuban Revolution, we sent the first medical team in 1961 to save life. At this moment, we have 75 medical positions, medical cooperation, medical around the world, even in Africa, in Latin American countries. But we say just with the only proposal to save life, to support to these countries, and to share that our revolution have. That's the opportunity that we have. If you start to analyze how this government start with the acts against the Cuban Revolution, we can say 2 years ago with this event, like the Star Wars event, with the Sonic attacks against the diplomatics, the US diplomatics and the Canadian diplomatics in Cuba. Well, where are the proof? Where are the tests? What they say? They don't say nothing. They say they are wrong. But for that reason, they reduce all their personnel in the Cuban embassy, in the US embassy in Cuba. and they put in zero or the consulate work that they do there. For that reason, now the Cubans have to travel to Colombia, to Mexico, have to travel to some other countries to apply for a visa to come here to visit the families. Also, this is the only country around the world that the U.S. citizen can travel, can feel free to travel. How is possible? Because they say that you can use these Cuban institutions, you can send money to the Cuban government. So, what are we talking about? We have a lot of things, a lot of advance in the technologies, in the biotechnologies, in the medicines that we can share with the U.S. citizens, like the lung cancer vaccine with the overthrow. We have a lot of things that we can share, but it's impossible for you have it here for this policy, absolute policy against our country, against my country. Some weeks ago, this administration signed, applying the Title III of the Harris-Burton law. So it's the first time that they signed it since 1996. What they say, he allowed to the person to claim for the properties that they have in Cuba. You see, there are so many people now that say that the International Jose Marti Airport belongs to my family, the Hotel Meliaco Iba belongs to my family, or the place they will have, the National Hotel. Come on, it belongs to the Cuban Revolution, it belongs to the Cuban citizens. It belongs, for almost 60 years, we defend our one small country for a lot of sabotage, terrorism acts against our country, against our people. And if we fought, we still fight, and we continue fighting for that. It's because we have principle. We learn from our commander-in-chief, the Patria Muerte, venceremos. And also because we have person like you. We have person with as the solidarity movement in United States, around the world, since the very beginning of the triumph of the revolution. Because when a lot of people here say, okay, we have to destroy the Cuban Revolution, the solidarity movement in Harlem, the Puerto Ricans, the Dominicans, the US citizens say, why? Is Cuba, it can be like a faro, like a light or faro that we can follow, and that is what we want for the rest and for the humanity. Thank you for your support.
And thank you, Rolando, for the incredible inspiration and example of the Cuban Revolution and the Cuban people. Now we would like to open the floor for questions and answers. Raise your hand, and we will get a mic to you as soon as possible.
Yeah, well, and I learned this again when I was in Nicaragua in the 80s, you know, that they used to say that Cuba was trying to Cubanize Nicaragua, right? And of course what we were told is, well, they're just sending teachers and doctors, you know, and you know, what they've done in Venezuela is incredible. The doctors go to very poor, rough areas that Venezuelan doctors are afraid to go to and, you know, minister to those people. And Cuba, I think, truly knows what solidarity is about. You know, I was reminded of this, again, something I had forgotten. You know, this movie or this series Chernobyl's out now. Again, clearly a propaganda piece to get your hatred against Russia going, right? But I forgot, again, that who took in the kids from Chernobyl was Cuba. Took in 20,000 children. and gave them free housing and medical care for the rest of their lives. And that is the story that isn't told. The other thing, you know, Venezuela and Cuba, even the New York Times acknowledged this in an article, acknowledged that Cuba and Venezuela were at the front line in the fight against cholera in Haiti, their medical teams. And Venezuela and Cuba have partnered together in Operation Miracle, in which they've given sight to millions of blind people around the world, including, by the way, to the Bolivian who shot Che Guevara in an act of what many might consider almost, you know, Christian forgiveness. But again, those are the things that we have to remember, are those types of acts of solidarity. I remember there's a book called Conflicting Missions, great book, about Cuba's role in liberating Southern Africa. You know, let's not forget, Nelson Mandela credits Cuba and Fidel Castro for their defeat of the South African army, which he believes brought the South African government to the bargaining table with Mandela. But in that book, they mentioned that right after the Cuban Revolution, right after Cuba began helping other countries, including Algeria, who also had a revolution shortly thereafter. And the Algerian president said it was like a beggar giving help to another beggar. You know, here's this poor country that, you know, by a lot of measures doesn't have a pot to piss in, and yet they send doctors to 70 different countries. It's a beautiful story, right? And one that isn't told enough. And these sanctions against Cuba and the sanctions against Venezuela that prevent Venezuela from getting cheap oil to Cuba are already hurting Cuba and the Cuban people, and it's going to hurt other people because it's going to lower their capacity to do these international projects. But we can't forget that, you know. And again, I want to mention the other thing about Chavez, the great enemy of the United States, who gave cheap oil to poor people in the United States, in the Bronx, in Boston, and who offered to help after Katrina. And Citgo, the Venezuelan oil company, actually did help, but a lot of the help Chavez offered was simply rejected by the United States. But this is our enemy, right? I mean, these are people who bear ill will towards no one, which is quite incredible. I hope that answers your question.
I just want to add that the U.S. has been trying to smash the Cuban Revolution since it started, just as much as it has in the Bolivarian Revolution. And for the U.S. press to claim that Cuba's contribution to Venezuela has been to send troops is just another piece of their usual propaganda and a way of gearing up to increase the sanctions against Cuba, which they're currently doing, as well as to prepare for an invasion. I mean, they're going to be looking for an excuse to invade Venezuela. I actually just want to say, I mean, a lot of you, I'm sure, are aware of this, but the U.S. has their plans all laid out. This is a Southcom document that was signed February 23rd, 2018, that's called The Plan to Overthrow the Venezuelan Dictatorship. As Dan mentioned, that's what they call a socialist government. And it lists all kinds of things that should be done, from the sanctions to you know, trying to get the Venezuelan military to back the opposition government, but if they don't move fast enough, that's going to get the U.S. troops involved in the country, as well as things like insulting and offending President Maduro, which Marco Rubio has been particularly good at doing. And it's not just about oil. It's not just about natural resources. There's another thing as well, which is that it's a threat to the United States way of life for North Americans to see a society that actually is successfully putting people before profits. I can tell you that the gardens that we saw are all organically grown, and that by the way, they're growing food to supply children for school free, and the rest of the food that they're growing is being sold at 50% below market rate to the communities.
Yes, and of course, Cuba for years has been completely organic in terms of their agriculture, in large part because of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the sanctions. They haven't been able to get these other fertilizers or whatnot, so they're 100% organic. Cuba is also the only country in the world that the UN has certified as being CO2 neutral. CO2 neutral. So they have no carbon footprint. And again, as you mentioned, these are unacceptable things. And Nicaragua, by the way, is one of the only countries in Latin America that is nearly 100% food sovereign, meaning they grow all the food they eat. And that's why they were able to get through this crisis over the summer. And again, I think it is worthy to talk about not just the fact that these countries don't consume, these pesticides we want to sell, but also U.S. policy, agricultural policy, is to displace domestic production, so they buy our stuff. Right? So you remember maybe that Bill Clinton said that he apologized. He said he destroyed Haiti's capacity to feed itself through his trade policies, which benefited, as in his words, it did benefit some Arkansas farmers who sold food to Haiti, but it undermined their ability to grow rice for themselves, right? And NAFTA did the same thing to Mexico. NAFTA displaced 2 million small farmers in Mexico. You heard 3 million, yeah. And led to the real destruction of the social fabric in that country. And Mexico is how it is today because of that. So again, that is part of the issue. They don't want people growing their own food. They want us to buy our stuff. A lot of times our crap, processed foods and whatnot. So. And a lot of human rights groups, by the way, are either neutral or supportive of sanctions, like the Washington Office on Latin America, when we know that sanctions can be as deadly or more deadly than a military invasion. Of course, the example of Iraq, where we know the U.S. sanctions against Iraq after the first Gulf War killed 1 million Iraqis, including 500,000 children, which, of course, as we all know, elicited Madeleine Albright's famous line that it was worth it, that 500,000 children died, And we have sanctions against 35 different countries right now. And those are illegal sanctions. And as you mentioned, we have to oppose those as hard as a military intervention.
Aside from signing whatever petitions you can see against sanctions in whatever country, we're also right now trying to find attorneys who are working to start legal cases against the U.S. sanctions in different countries. And between Pat and me, so far we've found 2 attorneys who are planning to start some legal cases.
I would help as well. I am a lawyer.
Right.
I am a barred lawyer, yes. Okay. Letters to the editor. We need to go to places like Venezuela, go to Cuba, go to Nicaragua, and tell people the truth about what's happening there. That's been what has worked in the past, and also to bring folks from those countries up here to talk. And it's arduous work, because I think it's harder and harder to get a voice in the mainstream press on these issues, but that's what we have to try to do. You mentioned, the migrant issue. I mean, people have to know that while there are massive amounts of migrants coming from El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, they're not coming from Nicaragua. Because the Sandinistas have created a stable, prosperous country. And if the U.S. gets its way and overthrows the Sandinista government, you're going to have massive migration. I mean, we have to look at what's happening in these countries when the U.S. goes to save them, right? The U.S. went and saved Libya, right? Obama and Clinton and Samantha Power. And what has it done? It's a failed state with slaves being sold in open markets. And those are the things we have to educate people about. What is it that the U.S. does when it saves a country? And I always go back to the quote from Eduardo Galeano. Every time the U.S. saves a country, it converts it either into an insane asylum or a cemetery. And that is what people have to realize. But it's a hard lesson. And all you can do is grind it out like we're doing it today. Yes, well, again, I mean, it really relates to the question from our other comrade that, you know, we need to have teach-ins on campuses. We need to teach on campuses. I teach international human rights at a law school, and, you know, the whole thrust of it is really anti-imperialism. You know, again, the idea, unlike a lot of people who are looking for the next place to invade to bring human rights, the question should be, where should we get out of? You know, right now the U.S. is supporting the worst humanitarian disaster on earth in Yemen. It really is a genocide. Millions will die. Millions. And that's where our focus should be, getting the U.S. out of places, not into places. But that really requires a change in perspective and the change in the American mindset. And all that, and that can only be done through writing and teaching. You know, teach-ins on campus, teach-ins like this. I mean, again, there's no easy way to do it, but that's what we have to do, and we have to challenge this idea that the U.S., that the 82nd Airborne is a human rights organization. It's not. And people need to realize that.
I just want to add that it's a fundamental principle of international law that no country has the right to intervene in the internal affairs of another sovereign nation. So the point isn't, do you think that everything Maduro or any other government is doing is correct? Do you agree with everything? That's a basic fundamental principle. And I think it's pretty easy to say to people, well, if you don't like Trump, how would you feel about some other country coming in here and invading us and picking somebody, you know, and putting them in the presidency and declaring them the president, and then going around and threatening other countries with trade agreements and everything else if they don't support your position. So that's one thing. Another thing I'd like to say is that in addition to everything Dan said, you can go out on the street and talk to people, and that's what we do in an organization that I'm a member of, which is Brooklyn for Peace. We have tables at street fairs, and we go out on the street and we talk to people. And overwhelmingly, people are not aware of what wars we're involved in, or what countries we have sanctions against, or what our principles are. And overwhelmingly, the initial reaction is, oh, well, how does that affect me? You know, and what we do is have campaigns, and one of the campaigns which Pat is going to be talking about more is a campaign that's called Move the Money. And that is, very simply, if 60% of our discretionary tax dollars go to the military, what about if we take some of that money and move it into the social programs that we need here at home? And all of a sudden, people become a little bit more interested in hearing you talk about what we're actually doing with those military dollars.
Please welcome the Legacy Women. They're a very special musical group. They're rooted in Afro-Dominican and Afro-Puerto Rican traditions. They are some of the New York City's most gifted drummers, singers, dancers of Afro-Caribbean music.
So I guess we're going to sing one last song. Candela, candela le damos, si quieren candela, candela le damos. Candela, candela le damos, si quieren candela, candela le damos. Candela, candela le damos. A lo imperialista, candela le damos. Candela, candela le damos. Si llega la guardia, candela le damos. Candela, candela le damos. A lo imperialista, candela le damos. Venezuela libre, socialista de su pueblo.
Thank you, Legacy Women. Another round of applause. They set the stage for a really great talk tonight. Thank you very much.